image that you see on the screen is the symbol of a movement that is sweeping across the tribal belt of the states of Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and Odisha since early 2018, this year. The movement is called Pathalgadi, and it is a movement in which the Adivasis of these areas have reworked a tradition of putting up stone slabs to honor their dead. It is an ancient Adivasi tradition. But now these stone slabs have taken on a new life, and they assert their own sovereignty over their lands. The Pathalgadi revolution is capturing the imagination of village after village, and wherever these giant green painted stones stand, the movement declares, marks the limit of entry to government officials. Inscribed on these stone slabs are messages of self-government, but where do they draw their legitimacy from? They claim legitimacy from the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act of 1996, PESA, from which these words inscribed on many of the stones are taken. I quote the PESA 1996, "Every village shall have a Gram Sabha, and every Gram Sabha shall be competent to safeguard and preserve the traditions and customs of the people, their cultural identity, community resources, and the customary mode of dispute resolution." In other parts of the region, the stones directly invoke the constitution, in which collective ownership of tribal lands is protected by the 5th schedule and other specific articles. 70 years of independence have brought tribal people nothing but exploitation and neglect, and these regions have been in ferment for decades. But the immediate trigger for the Pathalgadi movement can be traced to 2016, when amendments were proposed by the current BJP government of Jharkhand to two key legislations that protect tribal rights to their land, the Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act and the Santhal Pargana Tenancy Act. The legislation was passed, but aroused such widespread opposition that it had to be withdrawn. But subsequently, the very same effect has been achieved by the BJP government by the passing of amendments to another legislation in 2017, that is the Land Acquisition Act of 2013. The amendments enable the acquisition of tribal land for something that is called development. It reduces the scope for social impact assessment and reduces the powers of the Gram Sabha to merely giving advice. So when democratic protests forced them to withdraw the earlier legislation, they simply moved their initiative to another legislation which achieved exactly the same effect, which is to disempower the Gram Sabha and to reduce the possibility of social impact assessment. This legislation, this new amendment to the Land Acquisition Act, received the assent of the government this year. Now, what is equally noteworthy is that the actual act that has been passed, the Amendment Act that has been passed, has been kept out of public circulation by the government, and what the Adivasis can see, what the public can see, is only the draft bill. All of this has aroused deep anger, exacerbated by the kinds of methods that state agencies use to discredit the movement. Recently, there were reports in the media of gang rape of women performing a street play in a Pathalgadi village, supposedly by Pathalgadi activists who used this mode to punish the outsiders for entering a Pathalgadi village. Now, all of us must have noticed that in the mainstream media, many news reports are simply police handouts. There is absolutely no attempt to verify any of this by many reporters. It's another long story about what has happened to the Indian mainstream media and the corporatization of it and the control of it. We all know that. And so for about a month, all that we read were police statements masquerading as news, without even the use of words like alleged or police say that. So all we heard was that the Pathalgadi movement activists had raped women who entered Pathalgadi villages to perform street plays. The survivors of the incident were kept under what is called police protection for 20 days. And so for almost a month, the only version of the event was the one circulated by police sources. Pathalgadi activists accused by the police of this rape, one of them a relative of one of the rape survivors, are still in jail. When the women were finally released, the only one of them ready to speak to the media was very clear that the rapists were outsiders. She used the word badmash, and she said they were not Pathalgadi activists because she comes from a Pathalgadi village. She also identified one of the rapists who surrendered to the police from photographs in the media, and he turned out to be part of what is called a pro-police Maoist splinter group. In the what can I call it, in the glory that is our democracy today, it is apparently not even paradoxical to hear a phrase like pro-police Maoist splinter group. So this is who the main rapist was of the gang rape, who surrendered, who has been fully identified as this pro-police Maoist splinter group leader, and not a Pathalgadi activist. So these are all too familiar dirty tricks that the state agencies play against people's movements. All of this has aroused enormous anger. But the expression of this anger, and that is the point that I'm trying to make today when I say that the Constitution could be an insurgent document, the expression of this anger, interestingly, is through the assertion of the supremacy of the Indian Constitution. If you look at this known Bharat Ka Samvidhan is the title, while the government in power, in fact, has in letter and spirit eroded its provisions. Villagers of one of the Pathalgadi villages, Ghagra, where in fact some of the women come from who were raped, told the journalist Javed Iqbal, I quote Javed Iqbal's account of what the villagers told him, "We wanted to do the Pathalgadi program peacefully without confrontation or fighting with anyone. We wanted to erect a stone on the basis of our Adivasi parampara. Our aim is simply to inform people, to educate them about Adivasi customs." Why does the state have a problem with that? Pathalgadi is our culture. We want to tell them that this is how our law is. The law for Adivasis is completely different from that for others, and everything should work according to law. Now, when they're talking about Adivasi customs, we should not be misled that they're talking about some kind of culture. They are talking about their basic fundamental right to their Jal Jangal Jameen, to water, forests, and to land. That is what they mean by Adivasi customs, and they are asserting the primacy of the Gram Sabha to decide what will happen to their Jal Jangal Jameen, which the government in power today and governments over the years have dispossessed them from. Several leaders of the Pathalgadi movement, who include former senior bureaucrats, have been arrested under charges of nothing less than sedition. The movement faces the full might of state repression. However, a second rung of leadership has emerged, and the movement appears to be gaining in strength, discussing the setting up of an Adivasi Educational Board, an Adivasi Bank, and such institutions through public meetings held under trees. They spoke to scholar, and some of them spoke to the scholar Nandini Sundar, who was visiting that region to understand Pathalgadi, and one of the reasons they gave for setting up the Adivasi Educational Board is that mainstream education simply does not take into account the specific cultural context from which Adivasi children come, and there is a continuous devaluing and denigration of Adivasi culture in mainstream educational programs. This is why they want to set up an Adivasi Educational Board, which will give them not just access to modern education, but a modern education that is fully inflected by and informed by Adivasi knowledge, because the term Adivasi and knowledge are seen as a contradiction in the modern school system. Adivasi children are treated as if they are completely blank slates upon which knowledge has to be inscribed. And the idea behind the Adivasi Educational Board is to start talking about education that will treat Adivasi knowledge as a valuable resource to protecting this planet. Now, what is interesting is that these activists of the Pathalgadi movement, interestingly, the transformation of Pathalgadi from an ancient tradition to commemorate their dead into this modern manifestation where the Pathal, as in Pathar, stone, where this modern manifestation of stones which proclaim Pesa and the provisions of the constitution, this transformation is attributed to actually the bureaucrat who has been known for his deep commitment to the Adivasi cause, B.D. Sharma. He was the one who actually worked with the Adivasis to transform this. So we're really talking about at one level. So at one level you have this powerful movement, and if you look at images in the media, it's not covered very well in the mainstream media, but there have been some very good stories. You actually see pictures of Adivasis with their bows drawn and so on. But what they're asserting is the document that founded this country in 1950. What they're asserting is not some ancient Adivasi text, but an impeccably modern document, the Constitution, which they believe should be the basis of decisions about their resources, their land and their water. So where does sedition come into the picture when they assert the Constitution? This is worth thinking about. If anybody has committed sedition, it's the government of Jharkhand. So what is sedition? So the section 124A of the Indian Penal Code defines it as conduct or speech inciting people to rebel against the authority of a state. Can I have the second image, please? So that's just, it just, it says, I've forgotten the exact word. It says, I don't agree with you, and I will defend to your death my right to prevent you from saying it. I don't agree with you, and I will defend to your death my right to stop you from saying it. Now, so sedition is conduct or speech inciting people to rebel against the authority of a state. And what we find in the way in which the sedition provision is applied by the police is that the basic difference between the state as established by a constitution and the government, which is one of the arms of the state, that difference is continuously and at the end of that, the court wraps the police on their knuckles and releases you, but you have been through that process. The process is the punishment. Essentially, the charge of sedition is used against free speech and the right of citizens to criticize the government by the coercive state apparatuses, and it should be repealed, very simply. The charge of sedition has no place in a democracy. Section 124A must be repealed. Let us now consider the term insurgent. Insurgency means to rise up against established authority, but it doesn't necessarily mean an armed uprising. So to be insurgent is to resist an established order. How then can a constitution be insurgent? Does a constitution? What we find is that rather than people trying to understand one another, there are people talking past one another, and that opposing motivations come together to produce apparent agreement. So what I'm suggesting is that the Constitution is in that sense an unstable document which manages to bring about a consensus, and this is actually the strength of our document, of our Constitution. I'll say more about this as we go along. So opposing motivations come together to produce apparent agreement. These varying motivations and values come to fall into an apparent consensus that we tend to recognize in terms of existing codes, liberal, democratic, bourgeois, Hindu right, and so on. If we remove this familiar grid, however, we may be able to recognize a different story. As one instance, let me offer the debate over freedom of expression in the Provisional Parliament just before the first general elections over the first amendment to the Indian Constitution in 1951, which, among other things, this amendment, among other things, brought restrictions to the right of freedom of speech and expression. We find that Nehru and Ambedkar argue for restrictions, while S.P. Mukherjee argues against restrictions. S.P. Mukherjee as in the great Hindu nationalist leader. the well-known, I should have said rather than great. But we will see that the reasons for which they do so are deeply complicated by other factors. In other words, if we simply take freedom of speech and expression as some kind of liberal value and say who was against it and who was for it in the First Amendment debate, we will be forced to put Nehru and Ambedkar on the illiberal side as supporting restrictions on freedom of speech and expression, and the Hindu right-wing politician S.P. Mukherjee is the banner bearer for liberalism. Now, if you look at the debate, and I will show you how the debate panned out, that is those terms are not relevant. If we stick to terms that come from other contexts, terms like liberal and liberalism, we won't understand what's going on. We should not simply apply those terms to the Indian context without, in other words, we should start with the debate here, see what are the terms in which the debate is being conducted, rather than try to see if it was liberal or not. That should not be our project. Nehru, while introducing the bill and in his other interventions, repeatedly laid stress on two factors necessitating the greater need for curbs on freedom of speech. First, the moral problem, as he put it, posed by irresponsible journalism. Much of this I'm quoting, so I won't keep saying I quote and unquote. Less responsible news sheets are full of vulgarity and indecency and falsehood, poisoning the mind of the younger generation, degrading their mental integrity and moral standards. It is for me not a political problem, but a moral problem. Significantly, such newspapers that peddle filth are specifically identified as small sheets in Hindi and Urdu that do not require much capital. Others supporting the amendment also refer to various language papers that contain material of which any decent journalist would be ashamed. There are several references to the vernacular press as being full of filth and venom. So this is one reason. This is the main reason why there's a need, according to Nehru, for curbs on freedom of speech. The second reason offered is great peril and danger to the state. Nehru makes mysterious references to a time of grave danger, a kind of pre-war state of deep crisis, a challenge comparable to the challenge of war. He doesn't say what it is, but we know what the background is. It's Telangana, where the armed peasant insurrection led by the CPI was in full force. However, Nehru makes only a fleeting reference to this by saying whether it was in Telangana or wherever it may be. Later, he is more explicit. Every state must have the right of police power. Every state has to defend itself against an external enemy or an internal enemy, and freedom is limited for that purpose. And at the same time, the elite represented in parliament were suspicious of how state governments would use this amendment, for they might use such powers to crush political opposition or may be influenced by local considerations or by the will of the majority party there in the states. So Nehru actually says he would have liked to limit the amendment only to the central government. That is, only the central government should have the right to limit the freedom of speech and expression of the media, because, he says, it is possible sometimes for a state assembly to do something which you and I may not approve of. So this is in parliament. There's a kind of sense that the parliament has a greater sense of responsibility towards democracy than the state governments. The parliament has a better understanding of when to impose controls and when not to impose controls. But the state governments may not be able to do that because they are more bound by local concerns. Then, of course, it's the regional press that is really the problem. English media is apparently all right. So you can see there's a certain kind of very strong statism in Nehru's defense of the need to bring about these restrictions. Now, Ambedkar also supported the amendment, but for a very different set of reasons. So if we simply say Nehru and Ambedkar supported restrictions on freedom of speech and expression, you just won't get the picture at all. Now, so he supported the amendment, but for a completely different set of reasons. First of all, he points out that since public order is covered by this amendment, which is under state legislative jurisdiction, either this amendment must give powers equally to centre and states, or the amendment would have to be ratified by state legislatures, which would delay it considerably. So he basically refuses to participate in the debate on the terms in which it has been set, that is whether or not state governments can be trusted not to misuse the amendment. He says this is ridiculous to even discuss it because this is a state subject and you cannot have a law which will just give the center this right. So he just makes this simple constitutional argument and moves on. But why does he support these restrictions on the freedom of expression? He makes no reference to immorality. Nehru said it's not a political question but a moral question. Ambedkar makes no reference to immorality. He makes absolutely no mention for the need to protect the state's power to defend itself from internal and external enemies. What does he focus on characteristically? And Dr. Sunil Ilaiyadam's speech also made reference to Ambedkar's concern for something other than political sovereignty. So what he does is he focuses on public order and incitement to offense. And he gives instances and concrete cases where this incitement to offense has taken place. Social boycott calls by caste Hindus of scheduled castes, prevention of scheduled caste people from using wells. So the restrictions on freedom of speech and expression that he's talking about refer to these kinds of speech which are actually action. That is, by calling for a social boycott, you're not physically attacking anybody. By saying that scheduled castes, which is of course the term that Ambedkar uses, should not use a well, you're not physically touching anybody, not yet. But that very speech is violent. That speech is an incitement to social violence, to removal of Dalits from the social space. That is what a call for social boycott means. That is what a call not to permit Dalits to use wells means. So Ambedkar is focusing on the violence implicit and embedded in certain kinds of speech by powerful castes. And he therefore asked if the definition of incitement to violence should be extended to cover situations where one community does something in order to harm or injure another community. So he, as you can see, is defending the restrictions on the right to speech, of freedom and expression, from the point of view of democracy, of social democracy and social justice. He's talking about the way in which establishing of the mere political freedom from the British, does not do anything to transform a deeply unjust and hierarchical and violent caste society. Now, the only voice opposing the amendment was made by the Hindu right-wing leader S.P. Mukherjee, and it's obviously because the Hindu right was so thoroughly crushed and marginalized by the Indian state at that time. So he produced impeccably liberal arguments, and he said, to oppose these restrictions, and he said no country can be governed by force or coercion, pointing out that existing provisions of preventive detention and so on are sufficient to handle the situation. Referring to the new provision of restrictions on freedom of expression in the interest of friendly relations with foreign countries, Mukherjee demanded to know if this would preclude criticism of foreign countries, but more importantly, he declared, if I hold that this partition has been a mistake and has to be annulled someday or the other, would I have the right to agitate for it? So there are then at least three positions on freedom of speech during the debate on the First Amendment to the Constitution: Nehru's authoritarian statism, Mukherjee's classic liberalism, and Ambedkar's severe distrust of unrestricted freedom of expression in a society marked by extreme inequality and inhuman oppression. The distrust of the unbridled rule of the people is evident in Nehru and Ambedkar, arising from very different reasons, while Mukherjee's apparently liberal position arises from the muffling of the Hindu right at that time. I find Ambedkar's voice as reflected in the Constitution the insurgent one. For his every intervention is about social transformation. Ambedkar treats the Constitution as a document of change, a manifesto for the future, as it were, for the social revolution that he insisted had to accompany the political one. It is true that he was disillusioned by the Constitution as it eventually emerged, because he had little faith in India's casteist majority, which is what he believed would be reflected in Parliament. He wanted instead a strong executive that would not be swayed by the majority. Perhaps, in fact, I'm fairly certain, he would have reconsidered this position in today's India, where it is more than likely that an all-powerful executive would most probably reflect and shore up power structures as they exist, But the rationale behind his belief in a strong executive at that time was his deep suspicion of majoritarianism in a society founded on casteism. He therefore thought of the Constitution as a roadmap to the future, not as something that legitimized society as it was. In this sense, Nehru too had a sense of the Constitution as a document that acted as a roadmap to the future. In an interesting distinction between fundamental rights and directive principles, he said, directive principles represent a dynamic movement towards a certain objective, while fundamental rights represent something static to preserve certain rights that exist. But even rights are not really static, as the French philosopher Etienne Balibar has pointed out. New rights keep emerging out of movements, or are invented, as he puts it, and must be recognized. Every new right has the potential to put into question an existing social order, and I quote Balibar, even if it be the democratic and juridical order of a constitutional state that within certain limits and within a certain field institutes freedom and equality. The invention of new rights then supposes, says Balibar, an insurrectional act. I quote him, in the sense in which insurrection is opposed to the stability of a constitution and yet prepares and founds it. By using the term insurgent alongside constitution, I am reformulating an argument I had made in my earlier work, in which I referred to a dilemma that arises at the interface of radical political practice with the logic of constitutionalism. By constitutionalism, I refer to a specific method adopted by modern democracies of safeguarding the autonomy of the individual self. It is now generally recognized, however, that this objective is achieved by a process of enforcing universal norms that marginalize, render obsolete, and delegitimize contesting worldviews and value systems. This particular method of organizing democracies has a specific history and arose in a particular geopolitical location, that is Europe in the 17th century. By historicizing this method, we remind ourselves, to use Upendra Bakshi's words, that much of the business of modern constitutionalism was transacted during the early halcyon days of imperialism. That historical time space, says Bakshi, marks a combined and uneven development of the world in the processes of early modernity. Constitutionalism inherits the propensity for violent social exclusion from the modern, unquote. The drive of constitutionality, I argued then, is towards the erasure of any kind of normative ethic which differs from its own unitary ethic. Constitutions are usually seen as legal documents that embody a certain new dispensation or structure of power and which become our reference points in the context of resolution of disputes among different sections of people. So Marxists, for instance, might talk of bourgeois or socialist constitutions, and there will certainly be an element of truth in the characterization of many modern constitutions as bourgeois, as protecting bourgeois property rights and a bourgeois order. However, that does not exhaust the full meaning of what constitutions are. For what we see in contemporary India, at any rate, and I think that we might be able to apply this to the study of constitutions in democracies like South Africa, which have come out of violent apartheid system and a very representative process of constitution building, in that sense similar to India. Constitutions which emerge, I think, out of anti-imperialist struggles, anti-racist struggles, in which a variety of voices are able to make their voices heard in the process. While these constitutions are by no means perfect documents, what we, I think, find in, and I will speak about India, is that the constitution no longer lives the singular life that liberal constitutionalism laid out for it. We saw again and again from here both Chinta Ravi's work and Sunil Iladam's work is to talk about, you know, the thousands of forests within one seed, right? I mean, that kind of multiplicity that we celebrate. What we actually find is that the Constitution has not ever lived the singular life that liberal constitutionalism laid out for it, but has become, for many sections of the population, a call to radical transformation as well. The Constitution has broken out of the confines of the liberal imagination and attempts to keep it in the safe custody of constitutional experts. There are two reasons for this, I suggest. First, as I argue above, the Indian Constitution is not merely a liberal document in any sense. It reflects a variety of political opinions from left to right, emerging from a mass anti-imperialist struggle. And there was a continuous struggle to balance individual and community, equality and special provisions for historically disadvantaged groups, the drive towards industrialization and the rights of the peasantry, and so on. This is a very different moment in time and space from that which produced the constitutions of the West, which in a sense marked a closure of and an end to political ferment. The constitutions of which swept Europe, through the French Revolution and so on, were attempts to end all contradiction, all dispute, and to end the political ferment. But the Indian Constitution is, the more you look at the debates, you realize this, is seen by all participants as the beginning of a journey towards what the preamble promised. So if you look at the preamble, it says, we the people of India give to ourselves, but what we give to ourselves is potential and a horizon of possibilities, which can be interpreted in multiple ways, as we saw from the Pathalgadi revolution. I will talk about two more movements very quickly. The second reason why the Constitution is emerging as the banner of revolt for some struggles is the very nature of Indian democracy, which has rarely remained confined to participating in elections. Let me reiterate, of course, and let me very quickly get that out of the way, that there are many, many movements in India today, democratic movements, that would not accept the Indian Constitution as a basis of legitimation. So I'm not saying all political ferment in India is drawing on the Constitution. I'm talking only about the many movements that express their anger towards governments by reasserting the vision of the Constitution. I'm saying that I'm only looking at such instances today where the Constitution is being used to challenge the kind of order that governments have set up, saying that this is not what the Constitution intended. I'm only talking about movements of that sort. The explosion of mass movements across the country over the past decades, and especially over the term of this regime from 2014, is an indication that democratic participation in decision-making has come to be taken for granted by the people. In these decades in India, we have all been very critical of Indian democracy. We have been very critical of, I don't think anybody in this room has been a great celebrator of Indian democracy as having achieved anything. But if the Indian democracy has achieved anything, it is the legitimacy of the idea that people have a right to have a say in decision making. And that's why you find this explosion of anger when that right is taken away from them. So it's been taken for granted, and so what we actually see is a growing divide between the people and the ruling elites, including of political parties. For example, if you look at the huge upsurge all over the country, beginning from Delhi, but all over the country over the gang rape of the young student in 2012, you will find that the people on the streets everywhere, in almost every state in India, were making exceptionally and unashamedly feminist arguments about public space, right to public space, the right for women to be able to move around the streets at night and so on, while the lawmakers were still speaking the old language. The debate in Parliament over the amendment to the Criminal Law Amendment Act, the amendment to the rape law, had absolutely almost nothing to do with the ways in which people were expressing their protest. So this is actually a moment in Indian democracy where there is a very big gap between how people think and what the lawmakers feel. Right now, I'm not talking about Hindu majoritarianism. I'm talking about the kinds of democratic movements that have exploded in front of us everywhere, from struggles against sexual violence to farmers' protests to all of those. What we learn from close analysis of debates over the Constitution at its founding moment, and from the banner of the Constitution that the Pathalgadi movement bears, is that the Indian Constitution, at least, is not a document that has managed to establish one unitary order. If it was meant to legitimize the Brahminical, patriarchal class society that India is, it certainly failed, for it ended up reflecting the heterogeneity of impulses of the anti-imperialist movement. It ended up, therefore, being a porous document, as I said, an unstable document with one foot in the future. While I do not suggest that the Constitution exhausts all possibilities for radical politics, it certainly seems to offer some kinds of movements the resources to think in radically transformative terms. So when Jignesh Mewani, the charismatic young Dalit leader and now MLA in Gujarat, when he counterposes the Constitution to Manusmriti, he is drawing on the insurgent possibilities of the Constitution. Pathargadi is one example of insurgent constitutionalism. Let me take up two more. The struggle against Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code that criminalizes same-sex desire, and the mass movement that led to the Right to Information Act. So this is, of course, just an image to of one of the big protests against Section 377. The Rainbow Banner, as you know, is the banner of the queer movement in India. So the public visibility of the queer movement in India, allied to feminism, can be traced to the 1990s. The politics of this movement has always tried to locate sexuality and sexual identity within other identity-producing networks of class, caste, community identity, both acknowledging them as well as demanding inclusion within them. What I mean by acknowledging as well as demanding inclusion is that, for example, Campaign for Lesbian Rights, Kaleri in Delhi, marched in a protest about slum demolition, but they carried the banner of Campaign for Lesbian Rights. So demanding inclusion within that movement, but of course recognizing that slum demolition is also the queer movement's issue. Now, what is important to note about the queer movement is, as of any political struggle, is that there are many strands within it. There are Hindu right-wing strands within queer politics. There are also individuals who want no other social transformation beyond decriminalizing same-sex desire. That is, they are not interested in anti-capitalism or something like that. They just want to live their lives as queer people with dignity. So there are different strands within the movement. But the movement as a whole, like feminist politics in India, tends towards the left as a whole. And it is generally mistrustful of the state. So the decision by the NGO NAS to file a public interest litigation in 2001 challenging the constitutional validity of Section 377 was not universally welcomed by the movement, partly because it did not come out of widespread discussions within the movement as part of a democratic process, and partly because many within the movement felt that the work of social transformation should precede entry into legal processes. Nevertheless, in the 17 years that have followed, many other petitioners kept joining in, including, among others, a coalition called Voices Against 377, Parents of Gay Children, Psychiatrists, and a group of teachers, of which I am one. A judgment is expected from the Supreme Court by September this year, as all hearings in a review petition have been completed. One of the landmarks in this long journey was the judgment by the Delhi High Court in 2009 that read down, that is, it reduced the impact of Section 377 to exclude sex between consenting adults. That is, right now Section 377 criminalizes all acts, quote unquote, against the order of nature, which essentially ends up criminalizing gay men rather than and transgender people. So it read down that act to say that if any act of sex between consenting adults is legal. Now, what did that judgment do? It anchored its decision to fundamental rights and declared Section 377 as violative of the rights to equality and to life and personal liberty, asserting that the underlying tenet of the Constitution is inclusiveness. So Justices Shah and Muralidhar declared, in our view, Indian constitutional law does not permit the statutory criminal law to be held captive by the popular misconceptions of who LGBTs are. It cannot be forgotten that discrimination is antithesis of equality, and that it is the recognition of equality which will foster the dignity of every individual. So this was part of the judgment. Similarly, the teachers' petition, which 16 of us filed, argued against Section 377 on the basis of implicit constitutional values. As teachers, we made the argument that Section 377 vitiates for everybody and not just for gay people the general atmosphere of free expression, learning, inquiry, and dignity that an academic environment should ensure. it's interesting that the courts are not really interested in this kind of argument. The courts want to see gay people, and they want to see gay people say our lives have been compromised. And in fact, one of the reasons why this review petition has been so successful is that some very prominent, well-known gay people have filed a petition. But we felt it necessary to make the argument that the removal of Section 377 is not for somebody else. It's not for somebody out there. It is irrelevant whether you are gay or you're not gay. The existence of Section 377 on the statutes books of India restricts every single one of us. It demeans every single one of us. It insults every single one of us. We felt it necessary to make that argument, although it doesn't have the same purchase in court as a gay person saying, I have suffered. And that's important, and that voice should be heard. But we felt it necessary to at least make the point that the existence of this provision is an insult to all of us, and that we oppose Section 377 because its existence on the statute books legitimizes an atmosphere that runs counter to the spirit of openness and acceptance of difference that should mark modern academic spaces. Its existence is not only an affront to those who are non-heterosexual, its existence is not only an affront to those who are non-heterosexual, but it is an affront to each and every person in the academy who believes that every teacher and student has dignity that should be respected, and that learning is a continuous and lifelong process in which fixed ways of thinking are continuously challenged and reshaped by winds of change. The Supreme Court overturned the Delhi High Court judgment in 2013, but further interventions later, a constitutional bench started hearing a review petition in July this year, the judgment of which, as I said, is awaited. In the course of the hearings, one of the key arguments that was made by the petitioners against Section 377 was that popular morality cannot prevail over constitutional morality. So there is a way in which the idea of constitutional morality is itself insurgent, that there is something that emerges from the Constitution which cannot simply be mapped onto what do most people think. Of course, it's another matter that I doubt very much that most people think that, I actually don't think most people think that homosexuality is a sin and so on, because there are very many traditions which don't say that. But even if you assume that most people do think that, constitutional morality is something else. It's something over and above what is currently expressed. So when you say constitutional morality trumps popular morality, you're saying that the Constitution, as I said, is an unstable document with one foot in the future. The Constitution is about what we can be in the future. A final instance of insurgent constitutionalism that I present today is the mass movement that, the last image please, is the mass movement that resulted in the Right to Information Act passed in 2005. This legislation was the result of a prolonged public campaign initiated by the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan of Rajasthan. You see them here in the image at a big, a huge mass meeting of the national campaign for people's right to information. So the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan under Aruna Roy and Nikhil De had made use of the idea at the local level in order to ensure payment of daily wages to casual workers. Now, the RTI Act, the Right to Information Act, is nothing more than legal backing for citizens' right to information from the government. It is nothing more radical than that. It's not at all, apparently, a revolution. It is not a revolutionary idea. The camp, meaning it simply says we have the right to information from the government. You can't imagine anything more narrowly constitutional than that. The campaign based its claim on the fundamental right, Article 19(1), which says that every citizen has freedom of speech and expression, drawing on a Supreme Court judgment of 1976, which linked the freedom of right and expression to information. So that judgment of 1976 said people cannot express themselves or speak truly unless they know. How can we express ourselves unless we have full information? So now these are the kinds of ways in which the Constitution is being wielded, because to link the right to information to the right to freedom of speech and expression by pulling out a judgment of 1976 is an extremely creative act. The simple, dry, bureaucratic demand for information from government and government agencies has turned out to be so powerful that time and again the RTI Act has been sought to be amended or to restrict its scope, and the powers of RTI officials to do their job has been to restrict their powers. The latest attack on the RTI Act is a proposed amendment that will dilute the independence of RTI officials by allowing the government in power at the centre to appoint them with uncertain term, powers and salary, thus reducing the Information Commission to a department of the central government. Journalist G. Sampath made the astute observation that alongside the efforts to dilute the RTI, we see the increasing pressure for all citizens to get Aadhaar. And Sampath made this very neat, I thought, a very sharp observation that Aadhaar is the exact opposite of RTI. Through RTI, citizens demand transparency from the government. Through Aadhaar, government demands the right to know everything about citizens while keeping itself opaque. So along with the moves to dilute and reduce and make the RTI Act completely toothless, you have the continuous push for Aadhaar, which is, as Sampath puts it, exactly the opposite. We want to look at you. We are telling the government, we want to see what you're doing, and the government is saying, never mind that, I want to know what you're doing. I thought that was a very, very insightful observation. Apart from legal attacks on the RTI Act, there have been innumerable actual physical attacks on RTI activists, and this dry, legalistic demand for information has turned out to be more courageous and risky than taking up a gun for revolution. This is because the use of RTI can unearth deep conspiracies within the bowels of government. To take just one example, Parivartan, which is an NGO which was at that time run by Kejriwal before he became so famous as the Chief Minister of Delhi and so on, he simply ran an NGO. And Parivartan used the RTI to obtain file notings. Did you ever, think of the words file notings and then think of the word revolution, and you would put them as antonyms. But file notings have proved to be one of the most important sources of information from using the RTI, which is why file notings have been sought to be exempt from RTI Act. That is one of the changes that were attempted, one of the amendments that were attempted. A scholar studying the RTI Act found that, and many of you may be government officials in this room, so you might have noticed this, or Aradhna Sharma, she says in her book that she found that in many government departments, notings began to be made on post-its. So you make your noting and then you whip it off. So you just delete the history of passage. So even if an RTI is filed demanding file notings, there are no file notings because the file notings was on post-its that can be simply removed. So what happened was Parivartan used file notings regarding the privatization of water management in Delhi in 2005. The notings revealed serious malpractices on the part of the World Bank, and Parivartan was able to block the deal that could have raised water rates by 10 times for Delhi citizens, a process that was carrying on in a subterranean, non-transparent manner to be presented as a fait accompli, but which was exposed through RTI. Recently, in a development barely covered by the mainstream media, an RTI activist from Mumbai, Manoranjan Roy, painstakingly pursued details of EVMs from 3 sources. The 2 public sector units that manufacture EVMs, BEL and HCIL, and the Election Commission. He found there was a huge discrepancy between the numbers provided by the manufacturers and the numbers of EVMs received by the Election Commission. Huge discrepancy, lakhs of EVMs, which the 2 public sector units have been manufactured, and the Election Commission acknowledged receipt of lakhs less than that. That is, he found that lakhs of EVMs produced are not acknowledged as received by the Election Commission, raising the question of where the excess EVMs are going and what is being done with them. Whenever I have spoken, I found this just randomly because I keep looking up things on EVM. I wouldn't be surprised if half the people in this room who are extremely literate, well-read, on top of everything, haven't heard about this because the mainstream media has blacked out this information completely. And almost everybody to whom I speak, this should have been headline news. It should have been on every... He has now filed a writ petition in Bombay High Court asking for a probe panel to be set up but we don't know how far that will go. Not surprising then that RTI activists, who are often lone individuals with no organizational backing and who live in the same area as the local powers they seek information from, are routinely attacked, abducted, tortured, and killed. One of the key activists of Parivartan, a young woman whom I actually met in an earlier campaign, who had been using RTI to tackle ration shop issues, was her neck, she was tried to be killed with a knife and her neck was slit, but she survived and she had this scar and she was speaking. Just before the elections, Delhi elections, she was a candidate, just before the Delhi elections in which Aam Aadmi Party came to power, she just died in a car accident. She was crossing the road, a vehicle accidentally killed her. She died. Media reports do not cover all of these, of course, and some deaths are staged as accidents and so do not enter the statistics of RTI murders. According to the Campaign for the Right to Information, media reports of more than 300 instances of attacks on or harassment of citizens, at least 51 murders and 5 suicides can be linked to information sought under the Right to Information Act. I ran into a young woman whom I know who was a student who was going to a big meeting of the NCPRI, National Campaign for the People's Right to Information in Patna. We were at the airport. I was coming here and she was going there. And she said 4 RTI activists were killed in the last month for asking for appointment of irregular teachers, how are teachers appointed in some school, this kind of thing. RTI warriors armed with nothing more than a 10 rupee form are correctly perceived by power networks to be dangerous enough to kill. Talk about insurgent constitutionalism. Let me conclude by asserting that the Indian Constitution turns out not to be a simple seal of legitimacy on ruling dispensations of caste, class, and gender. It is a document that emerged from the acute conflicts and contestations in the anti-colonial struggle outside and from the contentious debates inside the Constituent Assembly. Its vision, therefore, was never singular. Rather, it became something of a manifesto of a future state of affairs where the ethos of egalitarianism would be decisive. Thank you.